we've now got a starting component put together for our album list, which means we now need to figure out somehow an album list to make an HTTP request to go and fetch our list of albums. To solve this problem, we're going to have to expand our knowledge of React in a pretty big way. So remember, the big challenge here is how to make an HTTP request with React. Up until this point, the components that we have made, we referred to as functional components. So all the components we made, we would refer to as functional components. That is, they are functions that return some amount of JSX to be displayed on the device. And so as you look at album list right here, it's a functional component. The only rule behind these is that they must return some amount of JSX. That's pretty much it. To handle fetching of data, we're going to have to use a second type of component, which is called a class-based component. So I'm now introducing a second type of component that we're going to be creating. Let's check out a diagram to look at some of the differences between functional components and class-based components. As I mentioned, we've been using functional components up to this point, and I've got an example one down here at the bottom. Functional components are great for introduction to React, but their functionality, so to speak, is a little bit limited. You can kind of view them as through an analogy of like a garden hose or a pipe. You put data in one end, and JSX comes out the other. And that's it. There's no other ability for the component to fetch data or initiate more complicated operations that we'll figure out later on. It's just data goes in, JSX comes out. That's it. We traditionally use functional components for presentational needs, like just displaying some content to the user. A fantastic example of this would be the header component that we put together earlier. The header, all it has to do is take some header text and show a header. That's it. So that is a perfect use case for a functional component. The second type of component that we're going to use is the class-based component. Class-based components are more complex and they involve writing more code, but they have a lot more functionality built to them, a lot more capability. They can be used for fetching data, they're easier to use to write large components, and it's also easier to organize large amounts of code with them because we get a nice class type structure where we can add many helper methods in there. This type of component is called class-based because it is based on ES6 classes that extend a base class of component. This component base class is provided by React, and we'll figure out how to wire that up. In short, we're going to need to refactor this album list component from a functional component to a class-based one because we want to use it to fetch some data with an HTTP request. Okay, so that's basically our goal right now. We're going to do the refactor, and we're going to find out exactly how to use a class-based component to make an AJAX request. So, time to do our refactor. We're going from this functional component to a class-based one. To refactor to an ES6 class, we are going to delete the function declaration at the top, so that's step one. I'm just going to delete the entire thing, and I'm going to replace it with a class declaration instead. To declare an ES6 class, we first write the class keyword, then the name of the class, which for us is going to be album list, and then the class we want to extend from. So extends component. And then I'm going to place an opening curly brace. So I've got my opening curly brace up top and my closing curly brace down here at the bottom. By using extends component right here, we are indicating that we want to borrow a bunch of functionality from this base component class. So do recall that all files in a React Native project are kind of like silos, so I'm making a reference to component here, but I don't have any declaration of component ahead of time, so I need to make sure that I import component. This component base class can be imported from the React library. Now, unlike the destructuring that we used previously, I don't want to replace this React declaration with just destructuring out component to get access to component. And the reason for that is, keep in mind that whenever we write JSX, like right here, when Babel goes through this and converts the JSX to just raw JavaScript, it's going to turn all its JSX into a series of react.createElement calls, right? We saw that in the Babel REPL. And so because it says specifically react.createElement, I have to keep React in the scope of this file. So that's just a little bit of trivia. So to both import React, but also destructure the component class out of it, we're going to use a little bit of a trick with import statements. I'm going to say import React. And by the way, I also want this component property from the React library as well. So now we're both getting the React library and we're also receiving the component class out of it as well. Okay, one last thing to do to complete our refactor. I placed my class declaration, I've got the closing curly brace, but now I've just got this kind of loose chunk of code that's sitting in here right now. Whenever I write a class-based component, we must define exactly one method, and that method is called the render method. And the only requirement of the render method is that it returns some amount of JSX. So whereas before we had a functional component that returns some amount of JSX, we're now going to have a render method that returns some amount of JSX. So I'm going to add in here a render method by typing out render, an opening curly brace, and I'm going to wrap all this JSX with a closing curly brace, and then indent like so. Finally, at the very bottom, I'm going to remove the semicolon because classes do not require semicolons. Okay, so that's it. So one more time, we refactored this from a functional component to a class-based component. We use class-based components whenever we want to use React to fetch data or whenever we want to have a large component that might require some helper methods. The only requirement of class-based components is that we define a render method that returns some amount of JSX. Then whenever this component gets rendered to the device, React is going to call the render method, take whatever JSX gets returned, and place it on the screen of our device. So at this point in time, we should be able to refresh the simulator and still see the text album list pop up on the screen. So I will refresh, and hot dog, we still got all album list popping up here. Okay, so fantastic. We did our refactor. Let's continue in the next section and figure out exactly how we use class-based components to fetch data for our application.